Okay, so let's see. I will say that I'm a writer and a painter. I teach at Pratt Institute, and I do teach a class that has a lot of this content in it. It's about world building, and it's a hybrid class where we read literature, we write, and we make art together, which is kind of my favorite way of working, where it's all kind of combined, which goes well with the Free World Festival. Um, and I have loved falling into imaginary worlds for a long time. It's always been my favorite thing. And so it kind of made sense as an artist that I would try to build my own. Um, and I'll start with a little bit of history. Let's see if I can share my screen. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not able to, let me see if I can see my participants. Okay. I'm gonna keep them on the corner there so that if anybody's stuck in the waiting room, hopefully I'll be able to see them.
It's not a real waiting room, is it? It's like a imaginary waiting room?
It's a digital waiting room. It's hard to say what's real anymore.
Okay.
Okay, so why do we think imaginary worlds are important? I feel like I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but they are a place to safely play at difficult topics. There can be some remove between our world and theirs. So we can discuss some things that maybe are so loaded or have become political in our world, or are just so intense that they're really hard to grapple with in the real world with real stakes. They're also a place for escape. So kind of the other side of that is they're really fun, and sometimes you need a place to run away from the real stakes of this world. And also they work as a way to think about the future. So you can, there's a long history of science fiction writers seeming to have time traveled because of how they've written about things that have then kind of been built in the real world. But a lot of world building is about extrapolating from current trends and just thinking ahead and playing out scenarios. So it's a place for us to imagine and get a sense of what the future could be and what we could do with that future. I'm gonna start with a little bit of history because it's good when you're working in a genre to know where you're coming from and to have a sense of what's been out there before so that you can kind of play in it. You can get a sense of the tropes that exist so that you can bend them and make use of them, and maybe not fall too heavily inside of them, so that you can be aware of the cliches, so that you can sidestep them. And also because reading is really important. I think if I were to tell my students one thing to do in order to prepare yourself to create better fiction would be to just read a lot. And so if you have a little sense of what's out there, you know what to read. So when I talk about imaginary places in literature, there's no real beginning of the story because imaginary worlds go back as far as the written word. And they go, oh good, this works. I can admit someone here. Let's see. Great. Okay, so the waiting room works, although it did switch my slide. Okay, so in the beginning, these stories were not necessarily set in a different world, in a a completely fantastic world, but we're kind of wrapped into mythology and folklore and religion. The setting was often kind of long, long ago and far, far away. And the line between fact and fiction was blurry. Here are some examples of early fantastic stories. And it should become very clear by just looking over these that this is not just a phenomenon in one particular part of the world, but is super global. One of the earliest stories we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh from a very long time ago, 2000 years BC. And this included meddling gods, wild men, monsters, the search for immortality, and a giant flood. In fact, giant flood narratives thread through many cultures around the world, to the point where historians have looked for a flood to see if they're basing them on something that actually happened. You can, I won't read them all, but you can see that throughout the world, there are these fundamental stories that are fantastic and filled with fantasy and science fiction, such as The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter in Japan. A princess from the moon is sent to Earth during a celestial war. In the West, one of the first secular genres of literature, once the printing made it more possible for lay people to get their hands on books, was the genre of romance. And that came kind of after religious allegory. So you get the King Arthur stories, and you get wizards and mystics and fantastic quests and voyages. I'm going to tear through the history because we don't have that much time to spend on it. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the pendulum swing and how at certain eras, certain types of fiction become more popular. So it could be argued that science fiction as we know it didn't exist before the scientific revolution, because science as we know it as a kind of separate discipline didn't really exist before that time. Scholar Robert Scholes writes, "The history of science fiction is the history of humanity's changing attitudes towards space and time, the history of our growing understanding of the universe and the position of our species in that universe." It came at a time where there was a rediscovery of ancient texts, such as Galileo, at the same time as much more understanding of the physical laws that govern our planet, such as Isaac Newton's Principia. So then you get the pendulum swinging away from the mechanized worldview and maybe the kind of factory heavy and rational philosophy and mindset of the scientific revolution, and you get romanticism. There's a resurrection of the fantastic, the supernatural, the imagination. There's a connection back to those old medieval romances and the floridness of them. The Gothic genre is born, dreamlike atmospheres, gore, ghosts, madness. We get Edgar Allan Poe, some of Oscar Wilde, and certainly Mary Shelley. And at the same time, in the latter part of the 1800s, the Victorian era kind of births the fantasy genre as we know it. And this is where we start to get new worlds built from scratch versus just kind of, even in the Gothic horror genre, it's often still set in our world, but something's gone awry, or it takes very much place in the psychological. But here we get dips into whole new worlds. Um, we get the term fairy tale. Um, George MacDonald's Fantasies was considered to be the first fantasy novel ever written for adults. But then we get these classic children/adult fantasies as well, such as Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. One big predecessor to sci-fi as we know it now are these kind of cheap and sensational publications that were sold both in Britain and in Europe and in the US. And this is where we owe a lot of the creative thinking in sci-fi, but also some of its bad reputation, because a lot of this stuff went for cheap thrills and sexy, sensational, gratuitous scenes and violence. Some of it was pretty bad. Some of it was good. But the penny dreadfuls started in England in the 1800s, when it finally became feasible for something to be printed so cheaply. And each was a penny. And these kind of graduated over time to the pulps in the US. And they were called pulps because they were on pulpy paper. And we get a lot of the sci-fi writers that you'll probably recognize that got their starts here, including Lovecraft, Bradbury, Asimov, Wells, Clark, L. Ron Hubbard, who created Scientology, got his start writing these. Lee Brackett, Edgar Rice Burroughs. Comics also fed very strongly into the graphic novels and the comics that we have today. At first, they were just little strips in the newspaper. One of the first was The Yellow Kid, which you can see at the top. Another really important one was The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck by Swiss artist Rudolf Topfer. And we start to see speech bubbles, recurring characters. The first ones were family strips or adventure tales. And the famous Funnies was the first comic book, where it just took those little strips that had been in like the Sunday newspaper and put them together in some sort of order in book format. And that was kind of the first comic book. So before World War II, we have the golden age of comics, which originated the superhero archetype. You can see in the bottom right corner an example of that kind of drawing. In World War II, the comic book heroes, such as Superman, would actually fight the Axis powers. But after World War II, there was a big economic change in publishing, and a lot of those publications folded, and kind of a new era, which maybe people could argue there's less publications, but possibly they were more higher quality. And that's where we get the era of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby with Marvel, and then a little bit later, DC. And mainstream publishers for a long time were very wary of publishing genre fiction. We owe it to some really good authors who were able to bridge the gap between kind of pulpy sci-fi literature and what was considered to be high literature. I'm kind of against those terms, but some of the people that broke through that boundary in the 1800s, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Jules Verne is considered possibly the first full-time science fiction writer. He also created in his work many things that eventually turned out to be actually made, like a lot of his submarine inventions. The connection between his imagination and future technology is really interesting to look into. But he was often extrapolating the technology of the time. And then both of them, especially H.G. Wells, were commenting on British society. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, created, in some ways, the popular mystery genre. Also, the first fan fiction was born through his writing. And in the US, it was around 1950 when mainstream publishers began publishing a lot of science fiction and fantasy. George Orwell, Ray Bradbury, Ursula Le Guin, and Kurt Vonnegut were some of the most important ones to kind of break that barrier. And I teach a much more thorough version of this, but these are just a few pieces of media and literature that, in my opinion and reading, completely changed their genres. And speculative fiction or science fiction, TV or film really wasn't the same after them. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, some would argue that nobody has built a world as intensely and as thoroughly as he did still, in terms of at least a big popular audience. And he was in the same creative writing group with C.S. Lewis, and they fought in World War I together also. The Twilight Zone, and Star Trek and Doctor Who were all television shows that completely built new media genres. Kubrick's Clockwork Orange and Space Odyssey, and Ridley Scott's Alien and Blade Runner, and George Lucas's Star Wars, I think also were incredibly impactful. Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, as we were talking about earlier. Harry Potter, the best-selling books of all time. Video games. In the last 10 years, the video game industry has earned more money than Hollywood and the music industry combined. And so also, I think in the last 10 years, a lot has happened in terms of the popularization of these media, whereas I think even when I was in middle school and playing Dungeons and Dragons, I still had to kind of hide that fact from kids in my school. So it was considered nerdy, and it just wasn't what the popular or mainstream people were looking at. And I think Marvel has really changed that. It's become an insane industry, and it's including more voices. It's also mixing genres. And I think video games have also changed that, and Harry Potter had a big role in that as well. Also very wildly watched shows such as Game of Thrones, which comes from a book series that my friends would read in high school, but we'd have to hide in our lockers at that time. Okay, so let's see what time it is. That's a little bit of history, just to have a bit of a background, but let's talk about actually building worlds. So the reason I like to think about utopia, dystopia is that I think that this spectrum exists within every world, including our own, but also that within every dystopia is a utopia, and within every utopia is a dystopia. So it can be an interesting way to frame the world that you're thinking about. Utopia means no place. It doesn't actually mean good place. And it describes it would like to describe a society in which everyone gets what they want. But unfortunately, if you have a population of different people, they're all going to want something slightly different, and therefore their desires will contradict each other, and not everyone is going to win in that case. So the only way to get a true utopia is if everybody wants the exact same thing. And to create a population like that would mean kind of cutting out the humanity of your people, unfortunately. And one could say that certain regimes have tried. And it is interesting that even the word itself seems to understand its impossibility. The first use of the word was in Sir Thomas More's 1516 book, Utopia. And he started this whole genre of books where kind of white European adventurers take a ship and they find some island, and the island already has a utopia in it, and they learn from those people and then take the knowledge of that perfect society back to share with their European friends. The problem with that is that it ends up still wrapping in the prejudices of the society into their thinking. So even though the utopia he found in this book is quite egalitarian in many ways and involves a kind of socialist-like lifestyle, it also includes enslaved people. Also, if you have sex before marriage, you become a slave. So there's things that maybe we wouldn't think are perfect in this day and age. And also people cite Plato's Republic from 380 BC as a utopic model. But again, you know, he is giving all the power in the society to who he considers the wisest men. But you get what might be, so it's a kind of a philosopher ruling class, but you get what might be more of an oligarchy than any kind of democratic society where power is shared. Here's a short list of utopias. I'm going to give a reading list at the end of this to anyone who's interested. But one really interesting vein of utopian literature is feminist utopias. And those often reimagine gender roles for women or imagine societies with no men at all. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland has no men. Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness is a society where everyone is kind of genderless until once a month they develop sexual characteristics and couple, and then anyone can become pregnant, and then the next month they might develop the other type of sexual characteristics. So there's a, and then Joanna Russ's The Female Man is where women from different planets get together and talk about how gender is done on their planet. Love that. And you can see that some of these are not actual utopias, that they're really kind of dystopias, but somebody is trying to build a utopic model within it. Dystopia does mean bad place. You should probably be familiar with this one since it seems like we're living in one now. But they came as a response to the idea that a utopia was futile and to give warnings for society. For instance, E.M. Forster's 1909 The Machine Stops. Everybody lives inside this little pod underground, and they're piped in all the food and the air and everything that they could need, but they're completely alone, isolated in their underground pod, and they can text message each other. So it was kind of like, okay, here you have all your bodily needs. It should be a utopia, right? But it's actually terrifying. Here's just a few dystopian examples. Of course, there are so many more. You'll find these are much, much more common in speculative fiction because it's sometimes difficult to build a good story in a utopia because you don't really have a central problem, although you could. And then we have apocalyptic literature too, which can be a dystopia, or it could be kind of past that state. There are, like I said, long histories of flood narratives from the beginning, from all over the world. And I love also that the origin of this word is from the Greek apocalypsis, which means the unveiling or the revelation, and not the end of the world. And it comes from the book of Revelation in the New Testament by St. John the Divine. And in that, the idea was that certain people would be chosen and through the rapture would kind of be taken to heaven or to a good place, and the rest of the world would burn. So there's been sects of Christianity throughout time that have been really excited about this, and really looking forward to it, and kind of decided on the dates for it many times. Here's a little short list of apocalyptic fiction. Okay, so beginning your world. Everybody would start from a completely different place, and I think that's totally valid. I'll just tell you one way in, that maybe I find useful and that I talk to my students about. This is Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights from the late 1400s. It's a 3-paneled piece. It was like the cover of this talk, folded in like this. It shows the world on day 3, before God made the animals. So I like this painting because you don't really know what's going on in the world yet, but you start to get a feel and a sense for it. I like thinking about David Lynch's philosophy that he talks about in Catching the Big Fish. Let's see, I'll just read this. An idea is a thought. It's a thought that holds more than you think it does when you receive it. But in that first moment, there's a spark. In a comic strip, if someone gets an idea, a light bulb goes on. It happens in an instant, just as in life. It would be great if the entire film came all at once, but it comes for me in fragments. That first fragment is like the Rosetta Stone. It's the piece of the puzzle that indicates the rest. It's a hopeful puzzle piece. In Blue Velvet, it was red lips, green lawns, and the song Bobby Vinton's version of Blue Velvet. The next thing was an ear lying in a field, and that was it. You fall in love with the idea first, that little tiny piece, and once you've got it, the rest will come in time. I recommend this book, and I put it on my reading list, that I'll give to you all. He talks about often things kind of coming in a little kernel, and for him, this ear lying in the grass, when he was thinking about the rest of Blue Velvet, he would always hold up a scene that he had in his mind to that ear, and see if it kind of matched in terms of tone, in terms of like the emotional quality for him. And I like this idea of the seed. Eleanor Fuchs' Visit to a Small Planet is something that I also find really useful, and she's a professor at Yale who teaches playwriting. And she has this whole list of questions to ask a play, and she starts also from kind of far away. To see this entire world, do this literally. Mold the play into a medium-sized ball, set it before you in the middle distance, and squint your eyes. Make the ball small enough so that you can see the entire planet, not so small that you lose detail, and not so large that the detail overwhelms the whole. Before you is the world of the play. Still squinting, ask about the space. What is space like on this planet? Interior or exterior, built or natural? Is the space here confined or wide open? Do you see a long passage with many stations? Do you see a landscape of valleys and mountains, sea and land? Are we on an island, in a cave, in a desert or a jungle, on a country road? Now ask about the time. How does the time behave on this planet? Does time stand still? Is time frantic and staccato on this planet? Is it leisurely, easygoing time? I have too many windows up, so I can't read the rest. How is time marked on this planet? By clock, by the sun, by the sound of footsteps? What kind of time are we in? Cyclical time, eternal time, linear time? What kind of line? One day, one lifetime? And I'll link to this as well so you can read the full thing. Another wonderful resource for world building is N.K. Jemisin. She's the first 3-time Hugo Award-winning author. For every one of her books in the trilogy, The Broken Earth, which I really recommend. She teaches world building lectures and classes, and she always starts from zooming way out and asking, what's the planet like? What are the physical laws of that planet? And then she kind of moves her way down to smaller and smaller land masses, to weather systems, to geography, before imagining the people that would inhabit that land. And I recommend you listen to this Ezra Klein podcast that she does. She builds a world for him and kind of walks him through, okay, so you want to do a Pangea continent. So what would travel be like on that continent? Where, if you're going to be somewhere in the middle, how hard would it be to have any access to the ocean? And she kind of walks him through her questioning, kind of a Socratic method type way of getting him to imagine the world. And I think it's really useful. So highly recommend. Okay, so discovering your place. You never get to show the whole world, and you never even get to show most of it. So what your job is to pick the specific details that make the space feel substantial. It's good to mirror our world and deviate from it in interesting ways, but make sure that the rules of your world are kind of fully cooked into the world itself. I just read V for Vendetta with my class, and the example was the way that the Cold War had played itself out in the world of V for Vendetta was reflecting what happened and the kind of fear that was existing in our society in the 80s when he wrote it, but it was also very much a part of that fictional world. And also the place should be meaningful to you in some way. Fantasy can easily become too stylized or symbolic for us to care about. So you still need to find your own emotional kernel. Create a multicultural world. Think about the diversity in our world, in our city, in our classroom. For example, avoid an alien race where every alien acts and seems to be the same. There's a lot of stereotypes that end up in speculative fiction. So here are a few to avoid. The wholly simple people, the warlike people, the honor-obsessed people, Amazonian women, the kind of hive mind, bee-like people, the industrious worker people, or the native earth-centric people, which we see a lot. By keeping those groups homogenous, you end up stripping them of the humanity and the individualism, and also just making your story less interesting. And I mean that even if they're not actually humans, even if they are a different species. So complexity, it's important. It can be gathered through research or through your own knowledge and imagination. I find research really helpful. And it's also good to research our world because you'll realize how strange it is. And how many surprises and contradictions there are, for instance, in our own history, in any place or person that you are to dig into. A few quotes on strangeness. A single mystery is worth innumerable solutions. And these are all from speculative fiction writers. Strangeness is a perspective. It's not immanent in anything. If you read a book in which everything is at odds with the commonplace world you believe you live in, the book has to refer over and over again to the things in that commonplace world, or everything in the book will begin to seem completely familiar. This is a truism for fantastic writers. First, they have to establish the commonplace rules of their story, and then they can introduce the violations of that invented commonplace world. It helps to sustain a sense of strangeness if the story sticks close to the banal, or what we think is the banal. That's a really important point, I think, because if you're working in another world, at first everything's going to seem strange to your reader. So if you want a sense of uncanny or strangeness, you really need to build out the normal of that world first. I'd like to think that unknowability is the dynamo at the center of it all. And I don't see any other reason to write other than that you're trying to make the world make sense. But built into that is that the world is fundamentally a mystery, inexplicable, even as you try to explain it. Okay, so then you need to think about who is going to show your readers or your viewers around the world. Here are some examples of broad categories: the native, the tourist, or the conqueror. And these are notes that I took from writer Katerina Sedia's lecture, as described in Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book. So Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book is a great resource, which I also put on the list for you all. Highly recommend. But she talks about some of the benefits and some of the pitfalls of working with a native within a culture. So unless it's based on a culture you come from, it can be the most difficult point of view to adopt. There's a danger in imposing your own values or ideas about another culture onto the one you're building in ways that feel too simplistic or offensive. For instance, you can think about the kind of nature people trope, which is often used in fantasy. So people who live in the culture don't notice the normal. People notice deviations or that which is unique to their person or experience. So it can be hard to explain to a reader who doesn't know the world, a new world, just through people who live there, because they're not going to stop and explain it to themselves or to each other. Know whether your culture is a minority or a majority one. For instance, if a culture is a violent matriarchy, a character wouldn't comment on an overbearing woman, but would notice a submissive one. Star Wars is a good example of this. So we start in Tatooine with Luke, and that is a native in his native habitat, but very, very soon he gets thrown into the unknown and becomes the visitor. And that way we get this sense of real strangeness for him, and then we feel it for ourselves. It can be easier for the writer and reader to relate to because they're discovering the place at the same time. The protagonist tourist may miss nuances and misinterpret the culture in ways that are interesting for narrative ambiguity and plot. Avoid having the tourist's culture be unquestioningly superior. It's cliche and dull. So kind of happening upon a culture that they feel superior to. And then we get kind of the antagonist, conqueror or colonizer as narrator. Certainly you have a lot of plot right away, and certainly that tension can very nicely show us around the world, although maybe you'll have difficulty getting us to sympathize with our protagonist. Who knows? So then when you're also thinking about how you're going to populate your world, you have to think about who has the right to tell whose story. This is something I talk a lot about with my classes. Can you only tell your own story? Can you claim someone else's story as your own? What responsibilities do you have when speaking about or adapting a story from a different culture? And I think everybody's going to have their own answers to these, and I don't think there's any one blanket statement that I can make, but I do think it's important to ask yourself these questions and to really do due diligence to any culture that you're approximating or working within as a storyteller. So research is really important. Talking to people who might be closer to the culture that you're writing about, getting a lot of readers, asking a lot of questions, and also working with what you know. Another thing to be aware of is what voices have been most prominent in our culture. So who have we heard from the most? when we're reading speculative fiction and when we're watching it. Here's a nice, clear graphic. Nearly 90% of the books reviewed by the New York Times were written by white writers in 2011. So that gives you a sense of kind of racial breakdown for the authors reviewed by this one kind of top gatekeeper. And it is true that I think the majority of the people who have had the easiest time getting their voices heard as authors, as makers, have been white, have been male historically. Things are shifting. They're not shifting fast enough. But it is exciting to recognize other voices and to curate curriculums and your own reading list in a way that reflects more of the world and the great ideas that are out there. Also in movies, this is clearly an issue. This is a Guerrilla Girls poster from 2002. At that point, the best director had never been awarded to a woman. Now we've had one. Doesn't really make me feel any better. And at that time, let's see, I guess at that time, Halle Berry had won the Best Actress Award for Monsters Ball, but she is the only woman of color to ever win the Best Actress Award, which is insane. So I wanted to talk about Afrofuturism a little bit because it's such an important vein of speculative fiction and there's so many great ideas within it. This is Sun Ra, who is a musician, but more than that, also was a performance artist and had a whole, what he called an orchestra, like referencing Noah's Ark, of performers that worked within a kind of imaginary world where they traveled into space and created a planet for Black people that was more equal and more of a utopia. And so his music and performance kind of plays in and out of that imaginary world that he developed. Afrofuturism isn't one thing, it's a lot of things, and it's in every media. Here's a couple quotes about it that will give you a sense of the range. Speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, says Mark Derry, who coined the term in the 90s. An intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation, Sasha Womack. A program for recovering the histories of counterfutures created in a century hostile to Afro-diasporic projection, Kodwo Oshun. There are Black people in the future, Aisha Wormsley. And that's reacting to a lot of, that last quote is reacting to speculative fiction and sci-fi movies that are just all white or don't include people of color. Here's some great speculative fiction authors that I recommend. Some of these are on my book list that I will give to y'all. Here are some of my favorite visual artists working in the Afrofuturist tradition. I actually worked as Wangechi Mutu's studio assistant for 3.5 years, which was really wonderful. And we got to work on films, installations, and kind of 2D visual art. Grace Jones, Jacoby Satterwhite, who's young Brooklyn artist. And of course, there's way too much film, television, and music for me to mention, but here are a few of my favorites kind of working within this tradition. Janelle Monáe, her album Metropolis, Black Panther, Watchmen, Lovecraft Country just came out. It's 3 episodes in. Quite an interesting retelling. The Wiz. Okay, thinking about populating your world. This is an image from Brazil. So again, the people come out of the land. So this is a book more about history and theory, but I recommend it for people that are interested in developing worlds because it talks in great detail about how different cultures and societies have been affected by their landscapes. So when you're building your world, and this is something that N.K. Jemisin talks about all the time, you have to think about how the environment is going to affect behavior and resources and the type of traditions and rituals that develop in a culture. In your world, there should be several operational realities, points of view, paradigms, because not all people want the same thing, as we learned with utopias. Different histories and goals can lead to interesting tension and plot. People don't think of the land in the same way. So even thinking about that last slide, how people have been influenced by the land, some people might want to extract resources and other people might want to preserve it. And that can be an interesting tension to mine. Moments of miscommunication and misinterpretation when different operational realities clash are opportunities to show more about your world. In that same vein, thinking about how memory works for each group of people. So for a majority culture, their operational reality might be structurally present in the architecture, monuments, design, and language of a place, versus for Native people who have been displaced, perhaps their operational reality might be almost invisible in the landscape and architecture because it has been erased. Instead, they might pass down memory and tradition through writing and speaking. When choosing a protagonist. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit more micro. That was pretty macro world building. No, we don't have too much time left, but let's talk a little bit about character and a little bit about plot, because once you've done all this work, what are you going to do with it? So choosing a protagonist. Is the viewpoint of this character the one with the most to gain or lose? Does this character have a great amount of agency? They have to be able to make some decisions and act, usually, to be an interesting lead. Do the interests of these characters parallel things that you are passionate about? Questions to ask your character. What do they want? What do they need? Sometimes it's really interesting to have those two things be different. What are their obstacles? And what are they willing to stake to get what they want? A little bit about systems. There's an element of freedom in world building, but I'd call it a responsibility as well, to establish the rules of your world and then live by them. I can decide to plop a desert down here and a mountain range over there, but then I and my characters have to live with the challenges created by that. I don't unmake stuff when it poses a problem, just the opposite. Watching how the characters are bound and challenged by the things I create is what it's all about. So when you're thinking about building systems within your world, you do have to explain some things that you wouldn't otherwise in this world. And there should be some sort of consistent logic for those systems. Although at the same time, you can keep in mind that when you walk down a street in Manhattan, you'll walk by a post-war building, and then you'll walk by a old church from the early 1800s, and then you'll walk by a glass skyscraper. The real world is a hodgepodge of juxtapositions. So one trap that sci-fi can fall into is if everything looks new and shiny and everybody's excited to use it because the author just thought it up. But it's better if you think about kind of the histories and the layers of technology that's kind of built on itself. I think I'm going to skip over the plot stuff because we don't really have enough time, but I'm just going to talk very briefly about the hero's journey. And I can put a link to a little video about archetypes in the hero's journey that I find useful. There's a million ways to build plot. This is just one, and it comes, George Lucas was friends with Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell was a mythographer who studied world religions. And one of his main contributions, whether or not you believe it, was that he thought that there were these types of narratives that threaded through stories throughout the world. And one of them was the hero's journey, this kind of cycle of stages that a hero would encounter. And this is all the stages. Basically, the hero would go through a bunch of different trials and tribulations that would kind of force them out of the realm of order and into the realm of chaos. And then they'd be searching for something which he called the boon. They'd either get the boon or not get the boon. And then they'd either get to return or have to kind of stay in the other world. And you can call it the underworld. You can call it the world of the adventure. It's when, Bilbo Baggins leaves the Shire. Bilbo Baggins goes into the world of chaos. George Lucas was friends with Joseph Campbell and created the original Star Wars specifically about this cycle in a way to illustrate it. So it maps directly onto the very complex stages of the hero's journey, which I'll let you guys explore later. Okay, so bringing it all together, world building is not the story. It's kind of all the work that you do to build out the foundation for your story. It's the tip of the iceberg. And even though you've put in a ton of work and you've thought about it and you're so excited about it, you probably don't want to shove all of that at the reader. You only are going to pick the details that now you can pick. Now you get the choice to pick that exact right detail from the world that you want to share with the reader. And you should probably only show them the tip of the iceberg of the world that you've built. It doesn't and shouldn't all fit into the stories that you build, but those stories will be richer and more grounded because of the work that you've done. So, great. Those were the thoughts that I had so far. I know it's 7, so I understand if you'd like to head out, but if you have any questions or comments or things that came up, I'd love to hear them.
I do have to go, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh.
I have a question related to how you build your paintings. How do you narrate? How can you explain some world you are creating, your research? I've always been intrigued when I was looking at your work because I've never seen it. I always saw it via Instagram online. Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks. It really depends on the project, but I'm definitely a research girl. I love getting the lay of the land with as much information as I can. And for me, it is very much trying to figure out what the iceberg looks like so that I can choose what to show. For instance, I did well, right now I'm working on some portraits of spiritualist mediums from the mid 1800s. And I have been diving deep into their lives so that I can use the painting as a way to channel them, because their kind of profession was channeling the dead, and using that often to talk about women's rights and abolition at the time. They happened to be quite progressive and would not have been able to speak in public, and so use that medium as a way to have a voice. And so I'm finding out as much as I can about them in order to kind of mirror their practice through the painting. So I know that's not an imaginary world, but there's ghosts, so maybe it kind of is.
Mm-hmm. But then it's also, I suppose, your the images that, I mean, it's also interconnected with your life and experience. So you are creating also a scenario from what you have read, and then some ideas you want to illustrate in your painting.
Yeah. And painting's a weird medium because it doesn't lend itself super well to narrative, which I struggled with for a long time. And I think I'm going to start working more with film and little painting animations because I love narrative. But painting really works as poetry a lot better. Like getting at the heart center of something versus seeing a character develop or mapping something literally. I tried to do that with my painting for a while. And
that's why I'm thinking
much more interesting when I stopped trying to do that.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about objects that are introduced in your paintings, and they do support a whole set of imagery also. And it's also an open door to the imagination of the viewer. And it brings other world into it. So it's very complex. I mean, really looking a painting which has all that in it.
I like thinking of paintings as portals. So thank you. Yeah. As openings, and then the story kind of falls on the viewer if they want to kind of go there and explore it. It's a strange media I got myself wrapped
magical
into.
World, a strange magical world, you said.
I have a question.
About oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was about Frankenstein, because I've read that a few times, and such a profound book. And she was so young when she wrote that. And I'm wondering, you talk about different worlds and research and everything, but do you know what affected her that she wrote a book like that?
Real quick, Virginia, before you answer that,
yeah,
I need to dip, but I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. And shout out Kaylin. I haven't seen you in forever. It's good to see you as well.
I know. Last time I saw you, you had just gotten in that bike accident. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Wow.
And we'll see each other soon. For everyone else on the Zoom, thank y'all for participating. Peace, love, solidarity. Don't believe the hype in the media. Humans are beautiful. Y'all take it easy.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. I'll see you in real life soon.
Hey, welcome back.
Thanks.